Well, hey, let's dive right into this. I'm excited about today. We it kind of worked out perfectly. We didn't have a guest lined up this week, and instead of doing what we usually do, reaching out to folks and trying to drum one up, I thought actually I've got a topic that it's perfect timing. Because we're deep in the trenches right now on building a black hat training as well as a CTF we're going to be running at DEF CON. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the key components of what goes into making these things happen is building a lot of attack scenarios strictly for the purpose of training defenders. And this is a topic that I'm very passionate about for a few different reasons. First and foremost, it's because one of my secret weapons, like one of my I guess you could say kind of my habits of that have helped me be successful in DFIR, security operations, and all that good stuff is all of the experience that I have building and writing and then running attack simulations. And let me be clear real quick, not a red teamer, not even a little bit, right? I've never been a pen tester or anything like that. So, proper offensive minded folks might look at my approach and say, yeah, I remember when I first got started doing pen test stuff. Well, that's fine, right? Like that's not my primary focus. However, by being a defender and then shifting some of my focus and spending a lot of time understanding attack tools and attack chains and actually having to craft them and run them and then troubleshoot them and then figure out all of the controls that get in your way when you're trying to do adversarial things. Like for instance, one of my things this week is I was wrestling with UAC on Windows 10, right? And we as defenders, we have a conceptual understanding of some of these controls. Like we know that UAC is a security boundary in Windows, but like, do you actually know how it's a security boundary and how it actually does get in the way of adversarial techniques? And it's not until you actually put on that red hat and you try to do some of these things that you realize, oh, wow, okay, cool. So if I get a piece of malware running on a victim system because I was able to spearfish them, right, with an attachment or something, I can get a piece of malware running on that system. But if it's a modern system, Windows 10 or so with UAC enabled, even if that user is an administrator on the box, the safeguards of Windows is going to put that malicious process in a medium integrity context. And without some sort of UAC bypass, which is actually getting harder and harder to do these days, your malware is stuck in that medium integrity context. And if you're trying to privilege escalate to do some administrative things on the box, you're going to have a really hard time. And it's cool to see this thing from the other side because it helps, as a defender, it helps understand these controls, why they're important. And yes, that they are bypassable, but there's ways to look for that, to mitigate that, and so on and so forth. And so this topic that I'm talking about today is adversary emulation for the purpose of training defenders. And it's something that I've done for many years. And I again, like the benefit that I've kind of gleaned from it is it has made me exponentially better at digital forensics and IR, as well as continuous monitoring and SOC operations, because I have kind of a behind the curtains understanding of a lot of the attack tools that I'm here to look for and hunt for and detect. So let me bring up a screen share here, and I want to go through sort of my process. What I love is when some fresh, relevant threat intel emerges, right? Some new threat actor doing some new interesting thing, because that's where I get my inspiration. Because again, I'm not a red teamer, right? Like I don't just sit around thinking of new and interesting ways to break into organizations, because that's not really what my daily focus is. So I borrow inspiration from threat intel reports, right? Like that's the easiest, most efficient way to kind of do this. And one of my favorite new inspirations was one tied to last week's CrowdStrike shenanigans. I'm going to drop a link here in the chat. Something that hit the CrowdStrike blog back on July 24th. This was very soon after the big CrowdStrike debacle, and this is so predictable, right? This is basically a threat actor emerged, to capitalize on the sort of chaos and confusion that arose out of the blue screen panics, right? And what the threat actor was doing was basically taking advantage of the confusion to send out targeted spearfish campaigns, basically saying, "Hey, look, we've got a fix, we've got an update. Here you go. Like, download this update, and you'll be good to go." And this is brilliant, because if you think about it, right, your average everyday employee or person is generally somewhat fish resistant, right? They know, like, be careful with attachments, all that stuff. Okay, now throw in the chaos and the panic of you've got half or all of your environment down, folks are not productive, like everyone's kind of in this bit of a weird situation, and now you send out something that's directly discussing that same thing, that topic. I think you're going to have a higher likelihood of success as a threat actor. And so this campaign was basically targeting those downed users, saying, "Hey, if you install this, if you run this, it's going to fix your problem," right? And so, as I needed to come up with a new attack scenario, I said, this right here is perfect. But what I really want to show here is the way that ChatGPT has completely changed the game for this. And I know that this is probably one of those things that's like, oh God, another ChatGPT reference. Okay, but I really would like to demo kind of how ChatGPT has made not only threat actors' lives much easier, also defenders' lives much easier, but how you can sort of bridge the gap and use the LLMs for these purposes. So this is that CrowdStrike article I was referring to a minute ago, because there's going to be pieces of this I'm going to want to refer back to in a minute here. But okay, so I don't mean to sit here and look at this threat intel and then now have to replicate every piece of this. But I do want to be able to use it to train my defenders, right? So I want to be able to refer to this and say, okay, if this would have happened to us, what are our odds that we would have detected it and known how to understand it? Could we have reversed engineered the payloads and all that good stuff? And that's basically the goal that I have. I want to emulate this particular adversary doing this particular thing as close as possible, and then give my team the opportunity to kind of work through it. Because obviously the goal is we weren't affected by this, but what if we had been, right? How would we have fared? And so I'm going to do my best to kind of study this, learn about some of the really interesting TTPs that are used here, like the fact that they took an MSI and packed inside of it a RAR self-extracting archive with an exe file name here. And then inside of that was an insys or a nullsoft installation file by this file name. So it's wild when you really sit and study this. It's like it was an MSI unpacking another installer, which unpacked another installer, which then dropped an info stealer to the disk, which had ties to AutoIt. And by the way, AutoIt is going to be the coolest thing you could ever use if you're trying to do what I'm talking about today, which is emulating adversaries. And I'll expand on that in just a few. But I loved this threat intel report. It was very in-depth. It gave me everything that I needed to go and build basically an emulation scenario where we can put this thing to the test against our tools, against our controls, and against our people, right? Now, let me show you where ChatGPT comes in clutch for this kind of activity. Now, for those of you that don't know, if you pay for ChatGPT, 20 bucks a month, right? One of the really cool things that enables you to do is create custom GPTs, right? Where you can basically pre-train the model, or at least provide it a bunch of context to help all subsequent conversations that you ever have with that particular bot, right? So I have one I call my attack scenario assistant. And it's where I sort of lay the groundwork for how this thing should behave, right? You know, I want you to help me write training scenarios using threat intel that I feed to you. I want you to map those techniques to the MITRE attack, all that kind of good stuff. And I can even give it other reference material, right? Like, here's a scenario I wrote before, and here's a spreadsheet containing some metadata about the environment that I run these attacks in. So now the bot knows, here are all the possible victim users, here's all the host names of the systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this has been just like a force multiplier for me in being able to rapidly iterate on attack scenarios. So now let me show you what this looks like to actually go through it, sort of step by step. So going back to our CrowdStrike threat intel report here, right? I just fed this to my attack scenario assistant and said, I want to develop a new attack scenario inspired by basically this blog post, this write-up. And what it does is it reaches out, fetches it, and it gets all the pertinent details. It understands and unpacks sort of the attack chain. It even breaks it down into those minor tactics like I asked it to, right? And so the first iteration here is it just gives me a real high level sort of, here's what the scenario could look like, right? And I like that because it gives me an opportunity to sort of iterate on it before we start getting into the deep dive technical pieces. Now, this is fun because the next thing I ask it, and this is just going to show you guys how dangerous this is in the wrong hands. The next thing I say is generate the HTML for a realistic CrowdStrike Falcon logon page, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And there you go. It just spits that right out, no problem, right? And it worked. It looked just fine. It was a CrowdStrike, kind of phishing page. So I can take that now and I can host it inside the environment. And now I've got sort of my initial access vector, right? So this is the phishing page that the victim's going to browse to, and maybe I get some credentials, or maybe I just serve up a malicious payload, because really that's what the threat intel report did. The phishing link took them to a website where they would download a zip file that contained the MSI, that unpacked the RAR SFX, that unpacked the insits, right? So that's actually what I want to replicate. So I come back to my chatbot and I say, hey, and folks, you'll see right here, I'm showing you very transparently my process. This is the easiest thing in the world to do. I did not over-engineer this. I did not put tons of my own effort into this because I'm gonna let the LLM do most of the hard work. What's the easiest way to create an MSI that simply extracts and executes an EXE? Because folks, I don't know about you, but I don't make MSIs. That's not my daily job, right? So, and I'll just share with you, making an MSI is a huge pain in the butt. So I love the fact that the LLM basically gave me every single piece of the puzzle. It said, you're gonna need the Wix toolset. And here's a source file that you can use to kind of start to lay the groundwork for building that MSI and configuring it to run a command once it executes. So that MSI is going to unpack an exe and it's going to run the exe. Okay, but I still need that exe though, right? So I can make an MSI, but what I need next is I need this self-extracting RAR SFX. I don't know how to make that, right? So we're going to go right to the GPT and we're going to find out, how do I make a self-extracting SFX? And it's going to give me, I got some iterations here about the MSI. So it's going to give me sort of the tools that I need to do the SFX. I'm going to need WinRAR. Oh boy. Yes, that means I've got to go and install one of the most annoying tools ever, WinRAR, because as you know, it's shareware and it wants you to buy it and all that stuff. But WinRAR is the tool of choice for making that self-extracting RAR. So I get WinRAR and I use it to pack the next piece of the pie, which is this binary here, Symposium Taiwan, which was a NullSoft installer, right? As you saw here in the threat intel report, we've got this NullSoft scripted install system. So now I've got to ask GPT, how do I build a NullSoft installer? And it says, well, you go get your hands on that particular software. Here is basically the NSI script that you can use to package whatever you want to package into that insys installer. So folks, I know this is like, this is a Matryoshka doll of different executions here that's happening. So I'll kind of reel it back in a second. But really, this is the bottom level of that payload. This is the final thing that kicks off the actual malware. And if you think about how clever this is, what the threat actor was trying to achieve is super dense obfuscation of what they really wanted to do. Because if you were to just get your hands on this MSI, quick Yara scan or strings extraction is not going to find much, because that thing is packing another thing, which is packing another thing. And it doesn't all execute and expand until you run it, right? So it's really kind of cool to go through these steps and understand each of these tools that are being used here. So essentially what I did was I had to start with the bottom level most payloads, which according to the threat intel was an info stealer called Luma, right? So from the threat intel, when I finally realized, okay, what is the thing? The thing that they actually wanted to get on the box It's the Luma stealer. So I actually needed to start there, build the Luma stealer, then build the wrappers that it's going to be packaged up in. So naturally, I just shifted to some additional research to learn as much as I can about the Luma stealer. But folks, I'll summarize it. It's super straightforward. Like most stealers, this is just a payload that hits the box, looks for interesting data, packages it up, ready for theft, right? Folks, this is where something like AutoIt comes in super handy. So what I could do is I could use ChatGPT to basically craft an AutoIt script and say, hey, look, what I want to do with this AutoIt script is I want to steal browser data. And I'm trying to look for one of my tabs that I had open. It's fine though. But essentially what I could do is I could say, generate an AutoIt script that will emulate an info stealer that targets sensitive browser data, right? It's just this easy, folks. And AutoIt, for anybody that doesn't know, is a free tool that you can use to generate scripts that run basically automation actions on a system. And what's really cool about it is you can compile that into an exe. Oh, so for the very first time, it's telling me that OpenAI is going to refuse this. This is for training purposes only. Let's see if I can get around it. But what I'm able to do is generate this simulated stealer, compile it into an exe, and then package it up inside those other installers, right? So my insys, even I'm losing track, right? My insys, my MSI, and also my raw self-extracting archive. But this is the payload that I really need. And as you can see here, it took me a minute to generate this AutoIt script that will replicate an info stealer, right? So is this truly Luma? No, it's not. But it's doing the same thing that Luma's going to do. So if I'm looking for detection opportunities, a process that's suddenly reaching into multiple browser directories, extracting things like cookies.SQLite, places SQLite, and so on. And I do remember the first time I did this, it only iterated on Chrome and Firefox. And I said, I also want to target Edge because, as you all know, Edge is kind of the default browser on Windows these days. And so we don't want to leave that one out. And it was just like, no problem. Let's include Edge in that script so that we also steal the Edge secrets. Folks, I'm making malware as we speak. Like it's happening right in front of you. So again, I'm showing off kind of why the LLMs are so powerful and dangerous in the hands of adversarial folks, but I'm also demonstrating how it's very useful in the hands of defenders that want to emulate adversarial behaviors, because you don't have to go and become an expert on writing malware. That would actually be a waste of your time, when all you really needed to do was kind of emulate the behaviors of malware, which is actually a very easy thing to do now with things like LLMs. So boom, there's my info stealer. I just used the AutoIt toolkit to compile that into an exe and then come back and package that up in my insys, into my raw SFX, and then into my MSI. And boom, I have replicated the attack payload used by this threat actor. So now all I've got to do is deliver it into my training environment. And folks, you don't have to overcomplicate that. Maybe you just sneakernet it, drop it onto a VM desktop, right? And run it. Now, clearly, what you want to make sure that you have in place are whatever detection tools that you're hoping are going to be able to pick up this telemetry, right? So your EDR, your sysmon, your log shipper, whatever it is that you're trying to do. And then obviously the next part of the exercise is maybe testing your production detection rules against this activity, right? Would we have picked up this very bizarre series of unpacks that just unfolded here? Would we have picked up the strange command line arguments that were passed, for instance, when the raw SFX fired off with a very clearly understood set of command line arguments of unpacking a password protected RAR file? That's kind of unusual, right? Like there's many detectable opportunities here. But then ultimately, when that info stealer started reaching into the user profile, pulling cookies and things like that, would we have detected that behavior, right? And folks, I got to be real with you. It took me maybe 2-3 hours to replicate this entire thing from start to finish, even all the way down to the spearfish email with the fake landing page, the phishing page that a user would end up on to then download this payload. So it's a force multiplier, it really is. But to just show you a couple other really cool things that I've been able to do between the LLM and, for instance, AutoIt, right? I wanted to be able to emulate ransomware, right? And there's a bunch of tools out there that can do this, but I want my own because I want to be able to fine tune and customize this thing to do exactly what I want it to do. And folks, I got to again reiterate the power of AutoIt for this. And once again, another cool thing about learning a tool like AutoIt is that you're learning a tool that can be useful to you, but you're at the same time learning a tool that threat actors like to use. So for instance, I'm just going back here. This campaign leveraged AutoIt. So it's a coincidence, but a kind of happy coincidence that I'm also using AutoIt here. And so the more you understand, for instance, a tool like AutoIt, you're in better position to understand some of the different attack tools that you may encounter. But I asked the LLM, hey, let's make some ransomware. And oddly enough, the LLM didn't throw its disclaimer this time about saying, this seems unethical. Are you sure that you want to do this? It just went ahead and did it. No questions asked. It spit out an AutoIt script that would basically start from whatever location I wanted it to start from and recursively target all files by a certain extension and hit them with a statically defined AES 256 key, right? And IV. So, of course, would this have been like the most sophisticated ransomware? No, not by a long shot. But if I wanted to iterate on it, like, hey, generate an ephemeral key, don't store it anywhere, don't store it in the payload, and send a post request with the randomly generated key, I could very quickly turn this from a training payload to a malicious payload, no problem, right? But it was just this easy to generate a ransomware payload so that I could run a ransomware simulation. And so that's a little bit of the fun that I wanted to kind of talk through here. But I also want to bring up the chat because I'm sure I'm missing some questions or conversations in here. Lots. Somebody's asking, have I built a DNR rule for this? Yes, I have, Chris, but it's in a test environment right now, but I'm happy to share it with you. Would Yara rules detect? Damien, I love that question. And I wasn't planning to bring this up because I'm still iterating on it, but I love that you asked, so I'm going to bring this up. So one of the things that I've tried to get better at is, for instance, getting down to the specific IOCs, right? Of saying, hey, look, there is an existing Yara signature for this Luma stealer. And what I'd really love to do, I'm just trying to look for it because I didn't have that tab queued up. But what I essentially tried to do was say, hey, look, I've got this payload, I've got this attack tool that I've written, and I want it to match this particular Yara signature. So for instance, if we looked for Luma Yara signature, it exists. Right? We could probably find any number of Yara rules for this. And what I essentially did was I went to GPT and said, here's the signature that I'm using. Of course, I've got to go through 10 different blog posts before I find one where they just kind of like hand me the signature, right? Without getting a whole long to do. Anyway, without going down that rabbit hole. But what I basically said was, here's the signature. I want my AutoIt script to match this signature. And effectively what it did was it injected the particular detection strings into my Yara or into my payload so that it would actually fire on Yara. So again, why even go through that trouble? Because once again, why am I doing all this? I'm doing this to test my tools, to test my detections. So if I know I have a particular Yara rule set that I'm using in production, that's one of my detections. That's one of my controls. And so absolutely, that's actually the next thing I'm iterating on right now, but I don't have a production ready example of that. But wow, that was the fastest 30 minutes of my life. So sorry, folks. I hope that was useful. I know I was moving a lot. If you guys have any questions at all, you know where to find me. We're in the Lima Charlie Slack, slack.limacharlie.io. Pinging the Defenders Friday channel. I'm happy to dive deeper and iterate more on any of this. If you want to see this stuff live, you have an opportunity. If you check out controlaltdetect.io, you will learn all about the CTF that we're going to be debuting at DEF CON this year, so in just a couple of weeks, where you might actually get to see not only the scenario I just talked about, but several others unfolding in real time in a simulated environment with all the detection tools you could possibly dream of. So that'll be a lot of fun. I'll drop a link in chat here for anybody interested. Come hang out with us. Otherwise, have a fantastic rest of your Friday, folks, and we'll see you. Oh, one last thing. I'm so sorry, but we will not have a show next week, folks, because Black Hat. So multiple folks on this team that host this show, we're going to be traveling on next Friday in order to go and run a Black Hat training. So no show next week. I hope you can forgive us. We will, though, however, be on the air the Friday during DEF CON. So tune in there if you're able to. All right. Have a fantastic day, folks.